Welcome to the Fifth Estate. Marshall, Milgard, Moran, these names now represent painful reminders of the fallibility of the police and lawyers, judges, and juries.
In a murder case NBC News has been following for nearly 3 years. A man freed this past spring after being wrongfully imprisoned for 2 decades shocked a Bronx courtroom today by asking a judge not to throw out the case against him, telling me in an exclusive interview he is determined to expose where and how the justice system went wrong.
A report released today suggests that justice was not blind, was not always fair in Nova Scotia. The report is the result of almost 3 years' work by a royal commission which investigated the Donald Marshall case, and it paints a disturbing portrait of the system which convicted the Mi'kmaq Indian for a crime he never committed. The report says racism and incompetence helped put Marshall behind bars and helped keep him there for 11 years.
And welcome to the Fifth Estate. I'm Gillian Finlay. In 1993, William Mullins Johnson was jailed for the sexual assault and murder of his niece Vala. From the moment he was arrested through his trial and conviction, and for every day he sat in prison, he insisted, as so many convicts do, that the justice system had made a colossal mistake. But this time, 12 long years later, he was proven right.
I was recently exonerated after 27 years being accused and convicted of a crime I had no knowledge of, I had nothing to do with. I was 14 years old.
I'm an innocent man, Your Honor, and I have always been an innocent man, Your Honor.
There's innocent people who are going to die in prison.
The driver's door was flung open. That conviction altered the course of my entire life. I was cautioned not to run or I'd be shot in the back in front of my children.
Some people have longer sentences than I do.
Why were we not good enough for fairness?
Mine was enough to kill me.
It's cost me my whole life.
Welcome back to Wrongful Conviction Wednesdays. I'm your host Nadine Alaloul, and today we will explore the case of Dinesh Kumar, a new immigrant to Canada who simply was seeking opportunity, a contributing member of society, and who had no prior criminal record. How did he fall into the hands of the criminal justice system? What must have went wrong? In 1984, Dinesh Kumar graduated from high school. He then worked in Punjab as a goldsmith with his brother. In 1989, he got engaged to his wife, Veena, in Punjab. Veena was sponsored by her brother to go to Canada in 1989. Veena sponsored Dinesh Kumar to immigrate to Canada in October of 1990. Dinesh's firstborn, Sohrab, was born in Toronto that same year before Dinesh's entry to Canada. In January 1991, Dinesh found a job with Sandy Line Sticker Design in Markham, Ontario, as a general laborer. He worked there for 4 years as both him and his family lived in one-bedroom apartment in Scarborough, Ontario. Neither Dinesh or his wife Veena spoke English. Dinesh and Veena had a second child, also a son, who was born on February the 11th of 1992. They named him Gaurav. Unfortunately, Veena had a seizure on the day of Gaurav's birth and was diagnosed with a brain tumor. She had to stay in the hospital for a month, but the tumor was successfully removed and she returned to her family on March 3rd of 1992. Unfortunately, the family spent only a few weeks together before catastrophe and pain struck again. Just 5 weeks later, Gaurav screamed in his sleep one night. Dinesh said he rushed over to the child's crib to find him blue and gasping. On the night of Tuesday, March 17th to Wednesday, March 18th of 1992, Dinesh put Gaurav, now 5 to 6 weeks old, in his crib at 9 p.m. At 12 a.m., Gaurav woke up and Dinesh fed him milk. After burping little Gaurav, he put him back to sleep. At 1 a.m., Gaurav woke up crying and screaming. Dinesh went to him and picked him up from his crib. Gaurav gasped, went limp, and began to turn blue. Dinesh had received some first aid training at school and attempted CPR on his infant son. He and his wife Veena then called his brother, who told them to call 911.
ओए मदद करो, गौरव नीला हो रहा है और सांस नहीं ले रहा है। ओए तुरंत कॉल करो 911, अस्सी आ रहे हैं।
Dinesh and Veena called 911 and told the operator that Gaurav was not breathing. As they waited for the emergency personnel, Dinesh continued his attempts to revive Gaurav. Emergency personnel then took over and administered first aid to Gaurav. Gaurav was rushed to Scarborough Sanitary Hospital and his breathing was restored. Milk in his mouth was removed and more milk was suctioned from his stomach. Dinesh explained to the doctor as best as he could what had happened. Dr. Bilu diagnosed Gaurav as having suffered from cardiorespiratory arrest secondary to choking spell. A secondary diagnosis was also provided: anemia of unknown etiology, possible central nervous system hemorrhage. The same morning, Gaurav was transferred to the hospital for sick children and put on life support. Gaurav was announced brain dead on Friday, March 20th of 1992. The life support was removed and Gaurav died. Amongst all the tragedy that had took place, next, Saurabh, their firstborn son, was immediately apprehended by Children's Aid. The next day, March 21st of 1992, Dr. Charles Smith conducted Gaurav's autopsy at the Hospital for Sick Children. His findings are summarized as follows. Dr. Smith found extensive hemorrhaging within the brain, behind both retinas and around the spinal cord. It was his opinion, based on a great deal of supposed expertise, that these critical medical abnormalities had all the marks of injuries sustained after an episode of shaken baby syndrome. This condition arises when an infant is picked up and shaken violently. Because of underdeveloped muscles in the neck and spinal areas, the infant's head is whiplashed uncontrollably and the brain is ping-ponged within the skull. This trauma leads to hemorrhaging, which in turn leads to brain swelling and dire consequences such as death. After the post-mortem examination, Dr. Smith conducted further tests to clarify his initial diagnosis and at the time rule out any possible anatomical causes for the injuries. After conducting the test, Dr. Smith congealed his previous opinion by declaring that the injuries were definitely not accidental in nature, and because of the absence of external trauma, the injuries were consistent with his previous findings of shaken baby syndrome. Smith went as far as to say that the damage observed was probably the result of continuous shaking as opposed to a single violent shake. Dr. Smith was unable to pinpoint the exact time the injuries occurred based on pathological examination, but guessed that a baby with such critical injuries would be unable to feed normally, as reported by the accused in all his statements to both medical and police personnel. Smith claimed that the injuries must have happened during the time frame between the last feeding at 12:30 a.m. and the time 911 was called. During this crucial period, Dinesh was the only person to have exclusive control over Gaurav, and therefore the only person with the sole opportunity to cause the critical injuries to the child. It is important to note that there was no history of shaking, and shaking was denied on direct questioning. On June 26th of 1992, Dinesh Kumar was charged with second-degree murder. He was released on bail on July 10th of 1992. He was represented by Mr. David Gurrell and Mr. Daman Kisoon. The now discredited Dr. Smith was to testify for the Crown that Gaurav was a victim of shaken baby syndrome, a popular diagnosis at the time, which is now in serious question in the forensic pathology community. Dinesh knew that he had not harmed his son. However, he also knew that if he were convicted, he could face a lengthy prison sentence. He knew the prosecution would call Smith as their star witness, and Dinesh's lawyer, Mr. David Gurrell, said to him that Smith was seen as a god in the courtroom. If Dinesh were found guilty and imprisoned, he would be abandoning his wife and remaining son, who depended on him for financial and personal support, especially since Veena had still been recovering from her surgery. On top of everything, he might have been deported. However, Dinesh had another option. The Crown presented him a plea bargain that would change his situation completely. If he pled guilty to criminal negligence causing death, then he would only spend 90 days in jail to be served on weekends, and the police would not report his case to immigration officials. Instead of his family being torn apart, Dinesh would be allowed to live with Veena and Saurabh. Both his lawyer and his wife encouraged him to take the deal so that the family could try to move on with their lives. As Dinesh described it, we were all scared of the murder charge. My lawyer told me that we did not have any way to challenge the testimony of Dr. Smith, so I agreed, after much discussion with my family, to plead guilty. It was the hardest decision I ever had to make. I do not want my guilty plea to ever be interpreted to mean that I did anything to harm Gaurav. I did not. My wife knows this too. On December 3rd, 1992, Dinesh pled guilty to criminal negligence causing death. He was sentenced to 90 days imprisonment and 2 years probation. After his conviction, Dinesh's life eventually returned to as normal as it could get after such a tragedy. However, Dinesh never lost his sense of shame to admitting to killing his son, despite knowing that he was innocent.
Zealotry, incompetence, thinking dirty. Hardly the words one would want used to describe the goings-on in the office of Ontario's chief coroner. And yet that and worse have been said since the work of disgraced forensic pathologist Charles Smith came to light. His shoddy conclusions destroyed lives. He wrongfully accused and helped convict parents of murdering their own children. He tore families apart.
Dinesh Kumar was among 20 cases Mr. Justice Stephen Gouge had scrutinized at an inquiry into errors Dr. Smith made during his 2-decade reign as Ontario's top forensic pathologist. As part of the application to reopen the case, Association in Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted, lawyers James Lockyer and Alison Craig intended to argue that Dr. Smith's theory that baby Gaurav was a victim of shaken baby syndrome is scientifically unstable. James Lockyer told Dinesh that he was calling from an organization called AIDWIC. He explained that there was new information about how and why Gaurav had died. He asked Dinesh if after so many years he wanted to reopen the case. Dinesh responded by simply telling him that he thought of Gaurav every single day. At autopsy, Gaurav was seen to have an old subdural hemorrhage, likely due to the birth trauma, which is not an uncommon event. The presence of this old subdural hemorrhage raised the possibility that a rebleeding of it had occurred, leading to Gaurav's death. Dr. Whitewell testified about this at the Gouge inquiry. 5 experts testified before the Ontario Court of Appeal, all of whom agreed that Gaurav's cause of death was undetermined, rather than due to being shaken. In fact, several experts noted that diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome had become much more controversial since Dinesh's conviction in 1992, and there was no longer any consensus in the medical community as to whether this condition even existed. The experts concluded that there was no evidence suggesting that Dinesh had harmed his baby. One possibility is that Gaurav suffered a fatal hemorrhage caused by a head injury that he had sustained during his birth. In light of the Gouge inquiry's findings, the Crown agreed with Innocence Canada that the case should be reopened and that Dinesh should be acquitted. On January 20, 2011, the Ontario Court of Appeal set aside Dinesh's guilty plea and entered an acquittal. One of the judges, Justice Rosenberg, commented on the terrible toll this case had taken on Dinesh and his family over the last 20 years. Outside the courthouse, Dinesh showed reporters a photo of Gaurav that he always carried on him and said, "This will be with me until the day I die." Expert witness testimony and falsified forensic evidence are one of the main factors that led to the wrongful conviction of Dinesh Kumar. Smith's inaccurate findings and conclusions of shaken baby syndrome, as well as stating the time of the injury had to have happened between 12:30 a.m. and the time Dinesh called 911, is one of the main reasons that led to the wrongful convictions of Dinesh Kumar. The Gouge inquiry found that Smith had no training in forensic pathology, and his own field was pediatric pathology, which led to many misdiagnoses that put many innocent people behind bars. Further, Smith was a terrible expert witness who gave controversial and unbalanced testimonies, which tended to assume adverse and inappropriate conclusions. Another factor that led to Dinesh Kumar's wrongful conviction is the role of plea bargaining. He chose to plead guilty although he was innocent. The Crown must not accept a guilty plea to a charge when they know the accused could be innocent. Sources have stated that at the time, the prosecution did not act improperly as everyone believed Smith was reliable. However, I must say, offering a plea bargain of 90 days served on weekends and 2 years probation instead of the long sentence which would have been awarded for a second-degree murder does create some doubt on whether the prosecution cannot be held accountable to a degree. Another factor that led to the wrongful conviction of Dinesh Kumar was the think dirty approach, which is a perspective that presumes guilt first. It is believed the injuries observed were intentionally inflicted, which make prosecutors, experts, and pathologists ignore other alternatives to why a child had died. In many cases similar to Dinesh Kumar's, the babies had died from natural causes or pre-existing conditions, which were ignored. Another factor that led to the wrongful conviction of Dinesh Kumar was that he was a new immigrant who feared deportation. Therefore, his status of landed immigrant was used against him. For instance, the lead investigator on the case had promised not to red flag his file if he pleaded guilty to criminal negligence causing death, a consideration which would greatly reduce the likelihood of him being deported. It is important to continue to shed light on these miscarriages of justice. It starts with awareness and education. So please share this documentary and subscribe to our email list to keep up to date on how you can shed light on the wrongfully convicted. Email us at wrongfulconviction.ca if you want us to feature a specific case. Thank you for tuning into Wrongful Conviction Wednesdays. This is your host, Nadine Alaloul, London, Ontario.